Welcome, everybody, to our third installment of Writing Your Book, Getting to Done, which is all about the process of planning, writing, editing, publishing, and marketing the great story that you've got in your head. How do you get it out onto some paper and finish your book? So many of us start books and we never get to done. I've got my great friend and colleague here, Paul, with us. Paul, welcome.
Great to be here again with you, Jason, and looking forward to this. We had one heck of a jam session getting this ready for people, and I'm excited to share what might initially sound like a slightly boring type thing: editing, publishing. Right? No, it's not boring at all, and there's a lot of subtlety to it. And you're going to find, no matter which angle you're coming from, you're going to find value in this. I'm confident.
Absolutely. Well, I want to give all of our viewers and listeners here, because we've got a lot of them online today, a roadmap of where we're headed. So today is about editing and publishing. We've previously done a webinar on planning and writing, and then we're going to do a subsequent webinar on marketing your book. And this is applicable not just for books, but really for a lot of content development. Our focus is on a written manuscript and getting that published, but we're going to cover a lot of things that you can use for all of your content development. Now, today we're going to talk about demystifying editing. So, what are the types of editing, decentralizing editing? Who's going to do the editing process, and what are the steps in that? And then debugging editing. What is that process in because it's maybe a little bit more sophisticated than people give it credit for. And then that publishing process, what are my options? We'll get into traditional, hybrid, self-publishing, and some things that you need to keep in mind. I do want to make sure that all of our viewers and listeners do know that if they've got any questions, ask them if in the chat. If it's a general question for anybody, ask it in the chat. We'll be sure to answer that question. And then if you have a specific question, direct message either one of us. We've got a free editor submission checklist. So if you're in the middle of a writing process and you need to get it off to an editor, we got a checklist that you should follow to simplify that process. And then obviously we've got our one-on-one consulting to help you through that process. But to kick it off here, we've got editing and the three different types, three stages of editing. Paul, what do you think of that?
Well, one thing I really want to quickly add to what you just said, Jason, is that if anybody wants to watch our previous episodes, we did one on planning and we did one on writing. Having that background is going to be helpful to understand what we're talking about. So if you want those, reach out to us on DM or leave a comment in the chat and we'll get that to you. But I've been looking forward to this because when it comes to editing, I think there's a perception in the minds of people that, again, they think of it in a linear sense, as in there's a point on the journey where editing takes the focus. And while that's true, it's equally true that it's an ascending spiral, meaning you're going through it multiple rounds as from start to finish as you think about the project, as you write it, as you actually work with a line copy editor, developmental editor. And then there's even editing concerns going into publishing. And there are editing, not so much editing the written work anymore, but there are editing concerns as you market it, right? And if you're working on all of those stages simultaneously from start to finish with your project, you're going to see how they collide with each other. And so what I want everybody to understand is that you're editing right from the get-go, and you'll still be editing once your project is complete, figuratively speaking. So don't think of it as just, well, I give it to an editor, they scrub it and give it back to me, and then I give it to the publisher, and that's that.
Right. And so we're going to break this down. Like you're talking about, editing typically is thought of right after writing. And if you didn't catch our previous webinar, we talked about that structuring, staggering writing process and the scrubbing of your writing as that iterative process. Don't think about editing as the next step. What you're talking about is think of it as three different phases really of editing. One, which happens concurrent or with as part of your writing process, and then copy editing, which happens just at the kind of the tail end of that writing process, and then line editing, which is more of a distinct type of editing apart from the writing process.
Yeah, yeah. At every stage of the game, in other words, you want to be engaging some level of stopping you from going overboard with what you're saying, either because you're saying too much, you're not saying enough, you're saying it, but nobody knows what you mean. You're saying you're beginning to talk about something that has nothing to do with what you originally set out to write. And so, throughout the process of writing, one of the things that we strongly recommend is to hire a writing coach, to hire, and they function pretty much as a developmental editor. You can also do this with a ghostwriter, right? You can be very much dictating through meetings, through the interviews, what you want to write, and then the ghostwriter does a lot of the developmental editing. But what it boils down to is just what you said. No matter which stage of the journey you're at, you're going to be doing some editing. You're going to be doing some refining. And I tell people, right, even after you've published the book, you're going to go back and read it. You're going to be like, I forgot to tell this. I forgot to say that, which gives you an opportunity to edit, figuratively speaking, as you disseminate portions of that content. You can go into more detail about it, talking about it on a podcast. You can release a piece of content that talks about that concept, but then you add detail to it. So there's a never-ending editing process with whatever you're working on. Now, when you're talking about these three types of editing, yes, absolutely. So the developmental editing really never stops. But then you reach a point where you have to allow what you've written to be enough. You have to say, okay, I've said what I need to say. I can always come back and publish a second volume, an updated or revised version of what I'm going to do 3 or 4 years down the road if I'm no longer happy with it. But here I am. I've got to let this go. And I've got to let a professional editor who does usually they'll do a combination of the copy and line editing. You can separate it and parse it out if you want to, but I've got to let a professional turn this into fine-tuned manuscript ready to go to a publisher.
Yeah. Well, let's get into developmental editing because we do want to demystify these three different types of editing. Developmental editing, like you're talking about, is at that front end of the writing process. It is part and parcel of figuring out how you want to express yourself and what message you want to use or what message you want to convey to your audience. Because we, this idea of uh, if I had a manuscript and then I sent it to a publisher, the last thing I'd want to do is have my publisher send it back and say, you make no sense. This message is not compelling. I don't like how you talk about these things, because that short circuits this entire process. So using that developmental editing process up front, which you talk about, and we'll get in a little bit later. We'll unpack who should be involved at each of these phases. But this developmental editing part is not line editing. It's not sentence structure and grammar necessarily. It is more the storyline of your message and determining whether that message is compelling.
Yeah, I think back to what when we talked about the in the writing episode, the previous webinar we did, we talked about turning yourself into an equivalent of precipitation, right? And then we followed it up by saying, "Let the raindrops fall where they may, and don't come back and try to correct it like a grammar Nazi." And I think the same thing applies to your developmental editor. They should not be coming here and criticizing where the raindrops fell, so much as they should be saying, "Dumping the precipitation here does no good. Dumping the precipitation here causes doesn't move anything. We want it to hit here, right? We want it to land with this particular set of concerns. We want it to channel. It's sort of like channeling that energy, directing that energy. You One of the things you mentioned as we were doing the planning for this was that you felt it should be somebody of a certain degree of qualification with respect to being familiarity with the type of material you're working on, somebody who possessed a strong set of literary eyes, could look at it objectively and critically, but also somebody where you could see that the message what is resonating, right? So you're working with a coach, and if they're just sitting there, I don't get it. This is not interesting. It's not enlightening. It's not entertaining. It's not helpful. Then you can have a good idea. Maybe I need to go back to the drawing board on this. Versus if you see their eyes light up, if you see, I really like this section. This is really strong. it cuts through a lot of the noise. It communicates that concept very clearly. It's powerful. Then you have a pretty good idea just in that one-on-one setting whether or not what you're writing is resonating with somebody who is more or less in the target reader demographic.
Now that developmental editing process is also iterative with your outline. So that outline that you've created right at the get-go may change as you write more content and then give it to somebody who has a more critical eye on the overall storyline. And they might send it back to you and say, listen, that outline doesn't make sense. Rewrite that chapter. That chapter doesn't belong. And like you talked about before, you have a cutting room document that or cutting floor document, right? That
Yep.
you take the things that didn't make the cut today, drop them into that cutting floor document so that you can pull it back for later.
Yeah.
And I was fascinated because even in developing this whole process for these webinars and this course structure, we've got things that are on the cutting floor document which belong absolutely in additional webinars, things like public speaking or things like developing content for your blogs or your social media posts. Now, let's break down. We want to move then to copy editing. So we've got developmental editing. What is this copy editing component and how is that different?
Yeah. So copy, what I've found when you get into editing the copy, it's what is said, how it's said, when it's said, what's not said. It parses the language. Doesn't parse the grammar and the punctuation and the syntax, but it parses the language. And it asks the question, okay, this is what you want to say. Now, is what you're saying making sense? Is it flowing? Is it incoherent? Is it babble? Does it belong? Some of the developmental stuff trickles over. So that, a good copy editor will look at that and say, I like what you say here, but it actually belongs in chapter 5 instead of chapter 3. Having read, ideally they're reading the whole manuscript, right? And they're saying to themselves, this is really well written. It would really reinforce what's said over here, but it doesn't, it sort of goes off track here. And so I go back to what we talked about last time, Jason, which is that we're trying to, as best as we can, avoid the frailty of the human eye.
Hmm.
We ourselves, as writers and editors, can write something and read it out loud back to ourselves, but our audience is not going to do that. They're going to read with only their eyes. And so the human eye quickly wanders and loses its attention if you give it a reason to, no matter how well intentioned you are. And I think a good copy editor is going to parse through the language. They're going to look at how the sentences are structured. They're going to look at to make sure that the ideas remain coherent, that you're not warbling or wandering off topic. And they're going to say to themselves, okay, what happens when the reader reads this? Are they going to get confused? Are you starting to use some of those linguistic no man's lands that we've talked about before, like passive voice or excessive verbosity? Are you sounding very professorial as opposed to relatable? Again, in the context of what the kind of books that we're helping people with, we're trying to deliver a persuasive message, usually from a business standpoint. So we don't want to get academic and highbrow. That's what I look to for a copy editor to do, is to keep me human, relatable, coherent, flowing, and as eliminate as much potential for confusion or disinterest as possible.
Yeah. Even today, someone was talking to me about an intro for a LinkedIn cold contact, and so I started helping them with that. And I said, I said, maybe you should just write. For over 20 years, I've helped manage. I've helped manage people and their things for over 20 years. She's like, things, really? And I was like, choose the 5-cent word because it's approachable and it's truthful. What other word would you like to use that is more clear than that? A copy editor can look across those things with the eye of what word might I use there to get the essence across. Now, a developmental editor would have helped you figure out, is that really what you need to say in a LinkedIn message? Does that even belong in a LinkedIn message? Why are you sending that? Whereas copy editing again gets into some of the more details. Now we've got developmental editing, we've got copy editing, and then we've got line editing, which I think is what people think of when they think of editing.
Yeah, and here is where you want your very best Enneagram 1 perfectionist, language grammar Nazi, nerd working on this. And very often they don't really even have to be that attached or directly involved or knowledgeable about the message. They just have to have that super keen eye for detail. And I don't know. I've never actually asked this of any of the editors I've worked with, Jason, but I think a good measure of a line editor is that same principle we talked about last time, which is where they are willing to read that entire manuscript out loud to themselves. Because they are perfectionists though they may be, if you read it with just your eyes, you're gonna miss a detail somewhere. One tiny little detail somewhere throughout an entire book is forgivable, but you get that in front of an audience that reads and carefully pays attention and digests it, and they're gonna notice stuff like that. And again, it's not, I hate to be, I don't mean to sound like a snob here, because I can read broken English and I can still figure out what people are trying to tell me. It's just that I have to work twice as hard to do it versus somebody who takes the time to make sure that their English or their whatever language you're writing in is immaculate, right? It's tidied up. It communicates a degree of interest in the reader's simplicity for digesting the message. And I think that actually does something to diminish an author when they don't take the time and invest in a good line editing. And so when you're looking for that person, right, they have to be that same kind of person. They're meticulous. They read through it carefully. And and often, right, many times, if you've noticed, a change in the landing of a punctuation mark, a comma or a semicolon or an exclamation point, whatever, can seriously alter the continuity of one paragraph sandwiched in between two other paragraphs just by changing one comma. So you have to have a very good sense for what is the appropriate sentence structure here to convey, absent the body language, the tonality, the eye contact, the physical presence, that nobody can hear when they're reading it or see. So, very important piece of the puzzle. Don't skip this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in this age of easy content dissemination, we can create content easily, we can get it out easily through digital means. The book still remains a concentrated way of figuring out what you want, uh, like we talked about before, precipitating all the thoughts down into some sort of concentrated effort, concentrated message. And like you're talking about, if you don't go through the steps to refine that message, I think number one, it does the individual who's writing the book a disservice because it's not allowed. You've not taken the time really to figure out exactly what you want to say and how you want to say it, and then cross all your T's, dot all your I's. But it also does the reader a disservice because when you choose a sentence that doesn't make sense, it interrupts the thought process of the reader and takes them out of the storyline arc that they may have been engaged in and brings them back into it. Like, wait, what? No, what are we talking about? And that I think dilutes the message rather than concentrating it. So we've got developmental editing, copy editing, line editing, and we want to. I think the next thing we want to do is we want to unpack who does all this work. So this idea of decentralizing it, because I think the tendency is to write a book and then give it to mom, dad, brother, sister, best friend, and say, "Hey, you want to read this book and give me your thoughts on it and edit this for me?" What is a better method? We we will go under the assumption that that's not a great method. So what's a better method?
Yeah, I mean, mom, dad, brother, sister is better than nothing, but it's definitely not. If you're trying to move a persuasive message as a business leader, yeah, that's just not going to work. And so I liked what you raised in the beginning, Jason, when you talked about who is your support system and you categorized them into champions, supporters, resistors, and bystanders. Because as we were developing the course content, we're going to create a course out of this pretty soon. As we were developing that course content, I immediately took those four groups and I said, okay, at each stage of this process, what do these four groups do? Where do they show up and how are they best employed or engaged, I guess you would say. So when we were thinking about the developmental editing, the champions are the people who absolutely love you, and they can be helpful in this process to encourage you to, read drafts of it and say, "I love it." To share it, share the idea, promote you as an author. Champions are really helpful during that. However, I think we were pretty much eye to eye on this, and I saw the developmental editor slash author coach role as more of a supporter's role, because a supporter definitely is behind the project, but they retain a little bit more objectivity. They retain the ability to tell you this part is great, but now you're wandering way off topic. You're saying something that doesn't need to be said here. You're not saying something that does need to be said. You're changing the story, you're confusing the reader, you're making it right, you're making it difficult. And so um we this sort of came on a sliding scale. You get down a little further, copy editor. Now this is somebody who is a resistor is probably a really good category for this, because they're going to challenge the way you've said everything, the language that you've used. So a resistor, we're not talking about an adversarial guy who hates your work and hates your guts. We're talking about somebody who is not necessarily immediately impressed, right? Somebody who says, "What's the value here? What why should I read this?" Um, and so they're going to bring. You don't want them to bring a critical heart, but you do want them to bring a critical mind, and to say, "Okay, well, let's parse through it." So I think a resistor can be a really good copy editor, and a bystander can be a great line editor. Why? Because they're there to make sure the technical specifications, the stuff that is really hard and fast, needs to be there. Either it's A or B, is there, or it's not and needs to be fixed.
I think of when I was younger. I've done singing for my entire life, but when I was younger, my mom was always impressed with my singing. And I'm a good singer, I won't lie, but the I would sometimes get up and sing a song and forget a whole verse and just make it up. And at the end of the performance, my mom would be like, "JC did such a great job," which is super kind, and I love moms for that. But uh, she didn't ever say, "You know, you messed up that entire verse. You probably should
Yeah.
have memorized that a little bit better." And I think of that in the writing process, that when we give our work to the people who love us, they love us. They overlook all sorts of things, and the heart sometimes comes out before the mind, and we need them for that. We need our champions and supporters for that, because we need somebody who's going to walk the long miles of this journey with us and not give up in the face of something easier to do. But we also need somebody who doesn't love us, who's not overly impressed, like you talk about with us, uh, who who wants the best for us and is also going to not forgive some of these details, right?
Yes.
Because I talk about this, or there's two types of people who are going to read your book or even do business with you. There's the people who love you and the people who are not yet sure they should love you. All the people who love you forgive your sins. All the
Hmm.
people who are not yet sure they should love you judge you for them. And and I think there's a great exercise in going through that judging process internally before you release that something like a book to market. And that's where resistors or bystanders can really, I think, play a critical role in that copy editing or the line editing, because they're not leading with their heart, they're leading with their mind, and they're willing to tell you, listen, this doesn't make any sense. Take it back. Take it back. We're going to redo this entire paragraph because the way you explained it is not landing.
Yeah. Yeah, when I was back when I was completing my degree, one of the things I really treasure to this day was I had a group of professors, probably about 4 or 5 of them, that I got to know really well. I was, 8 to 10 years older than most of the students, and so they looked at me more as like a wild olive shoot as an adult and as a military veteran. But they were ruthless with what I wrote, absolutely ruthless. I mean, it's only a mild exaggeration to say that they crumpled up the paper that I gave them and threw it in my face, right? Because they said the same things. You don't make sense. You're rambling on. It's verbal vomit. I don't understand what you're talking about. You're all over the map. And I've never forgotten that. I said to myself, okay, I'm sick to death of being told this. So I'm going to do it all myself before I turn this document in. So I started reading what I was writing aloud to myself, and I found I could almost be my own editor. And after that, I never had any more problems with my professors about the stuff that I wrote, right? They just, they might one little mark here, one little suggestion here, but overall they were happy with it. And I discovered it's like so many other things, right? The all of the preparation in the shadows is what makes for that great brief moment where the reader is interacting with your book. Same as like from bodybuilding, right? I had the same thing. You're on stage for 5 minutes, but it's months and months and months of preparation, training with the weights and eating correctly and learning to hit poses and all that kind of stuff. And then you get 5 minutes on stage. Same exact principle at work.
Absolutely. I want to unpack something that you touched on a little bit earlier, but really want to bring it back here in this decentralizing the editing. When we talk about our champions and supporters and the people who we might want to read our book as part of the developmental process, in our planning session, you talked about it. It came out a handful of things to really look at when we want to choose that person, and here they are. Uh, Number one, they had experience and expertise. The people who are part of your reading process in that developmental editing, you want them to have some sort of experience and expertise. You don't want them to come in cold, because they're not going to give you valuable feedback, discerning feedback. Uh, Number two, you want to make sure they have some sort of interest in the topic, because if they don't have interest in the topic, they're not going to engage at a level as someone who does have interest in whatever topic you want to talk about. So uh, it's really critical, I think, to think of those two things. And then number three, I would choose somebody who has read a considerable amount of work on that same topic, because they have a breadth of understanding and a depth of understanding that is greater than someone who has just an interest and has had some experience and expertise. If they're reading other people, they're going to make your work better as part of that developmental process. And then again, as part of maybe don't give it to somebody who's your champion. Don't give it to your mom, because your mom might tell you she loves you even when you messed up the verse. Uh, what are some things to look at in terms of a writing coach for the developmental editing process?
Yeah, I think one of the things that is also all those things plus someone who is an amplifier.
Hmm.
If you've ever played an electric guitar without an amplifier, you can tell the difference between when it's unplugged versus when it's plugged in. And I think a good author coach is going to take something that you write about, and then they're just going to blow it up. They're just going, you're going to say, I was thinking about sort of piddling around with this idea, and that author coach comes and presses the nuke button, not in a bad way, right? They're putting it on steroids, and all of a sudden you've got an entire vista of written content that takes the reader inside and teaches them all of this stuff that was previously very vague. It's familiar to you because you're the subject matter expert. It's not your audience's area of expertise. That's why they're turning to you. And so a good author coach is going to hear something that you're talking about, and they're going to empathize with the reader. They're going to say, yes, you and I get that, but the reader doesn't. So let's unpack that. Let's spin this a different way, turn it into an allegory, turn it into some sort of relatable construct that a reader can access. And all of a sudden, you've delivered 10x the value in with maybe just one or two extra paragraphs.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, for resistors, I want to unpack that a little bit too, because we talked about them being good for developmental and copy editing. And again, resistors are not people who don't necessarily like you, but there are people who are not overly interested. They could take it or leave it, and they might be a bit resistant to something in your message. So if you have a particular viewpoint, something you want to sell them on, they might be like, hey, I don't need that. That's resistance, rather than somebody who's like, well, I'm happy to listen to you. Find the people who are like, hey, I don't need that. Because like Bill Gates talks about, you have a lot to learn from people who don't do business with you, but also the Segway. If people remember the Segway, which was the scooter the motorized scooter, which held itself up, and you could stand on it, lean forward, lean backwards, and it would move, or lean to the side and it would move. Uh, Before the Segway came out, it got all sorts of investment from high profile people, including Steve Jobs. And the message behind it was, this is going to change the world. It's going to change transportation. Our cities are going to look different. And if you've lived through those times of the Segway, you'll notice the cities are no different, because the Segway was not given to people who would have said what I would say: I will not ride your scooter in the middle of a Chicago winter. I will not ride your scooter in the middle of a Chicago day. I will not ride your scooter in the middle of Midwest heat. There are so many reasons to not ride the Segway, and that's why the Segway no longer exists. In fact, Steve Jobs, who was an early proponent of it, when it came, said this is going to be amazing. When it came out, he pulled those remarks back. If you get the resistors involved earlier in your message, you have the opportunity to refine your message. Maybe it's a message nobody cares about. That is potential. Or maybe it is something that you have an opportunity to refine how you're talking about that message and overcome that resistance, like any good salesperson. Figure out what the resistance is, get an answer to that, and make that as part of your message. So, resistance is a question that needs an answer. They've answered it in their head already. I don't need that. You have the opportunity to approach them in perhaps a new way by getting those resistors as part of the process earlier. And then those bystanders, we talked about them being part of the copy and the line editing process. The people who are asking, is this worth my time and effort? Maybe perhaps like the people who show up to a webinar like this, is this worth my time and effort? We want to deliver value that answers the question. Yes, it absolutely is worth your time and effort when you're going to write a book to go through something like this.
Yeah, and circling back to editing with all of that context, what you're talking about there, Jason, is when you are going through the editing process, if you have appointed the right kind of people, those resistors and bystanders for this latter stage of the editing, there is a I personally find it fun. I find it fun because I trust my editors, right? And most of the time they're right because they're using their head instead of their heart. But there's a fun few moments here where they say, I don't think you should do this. I don't know. I don't understand what you're trying to say here. And you say, I hear you, but I'm doing it anyway. Right? So it's not like a total lie down surrender, let these people walk all over you. It's a judgment call. And I've had a few just fun instances like that where I say, well, tell me why you don't think it's a good idea. Oh, this is what I think. Okay. Okay. Can I, and sometimes it is like you actually do a little mini sales job of having them come to the center where they get, okay, now I see what you're doing. Now I see why that makes sense to put in there. But other times, right, it's like, okay, I hear what you're saying, but guess what? I'm doing it anyway. And they are not in charge ultimately of your manuscript. They, ultimately they have to defer to you. Now, I'm a big believer in saying trust your editors, but sometimes they don't really they don't really understand fully what you're trying to do, and that's okay, right? They're not supposed to. They're there to be objective and to cut out as much chance of you losing that reader as possible. But if you got something that's really got to go through there, then you need to be able to stand your ground too.
Absolutely. And that's why you need multiple viewpoints, particularly with somebody who says you got to pull that out, because it offers you the opportunity to figure out if you should refine that message or if they're right. Maybe you're holding on to something that holds little value. So, moving on to debugging the editing process, we have some things for you. If you'd like an editor submission checklist, go ahead and send an instant message to either one of us. We'll make sure to get that off to you. If you've got a manuscript you're working on, and before you send it to an editor, you want to figure out how to simplify that process, we've got that editor submission checklist. And it's no secret that this entire webinar and forthcoming course rather is all about writing your book, making sure that you are equipped to get your manuscript done, unlike so many books which are partially written and then remain partially written until a person dies. I'd hate to see that happen. If you have a great message, you owe it to the world to get it out there. So we've got a special offer for one-on-one coaching for you. Now, debugging the editing process. Talk to us, Paul.
Yeah, a lot of this is covering what we've just talked about. So I won't repeat it, but there's a key bullet there. The third one: don't under communicate. Now, I tell my writing team all the time, you cannot over communicate in our business. And I, by that, I don't mean that you should be texting your editor every 5 minutes. Are you okay? Are you okay? I'm not talking about that. I'm saying some editors need more communication than others. So if you get one who's pretty quiet, they just go and do their job, and their every response they give you is 2 to 3 words at the most, then you can you can just let them get on with their work. But there'll be a lot of instances, I think, um, particularly with the developmental editor, that just needs a lot of back and forth because when you and I were working, Jason, on your book, we were working primarily through Google Docs. Now, you can do a lot of really good stuff through Google Docs, but you're running up against the same problem that you are as the author with the audience, and that is that you're communicating using the written word. And so we decided to start using Marco Polo as well, because sometimes what you want to say, the written word is just not enough until it's been refined. But first, we need to get the raw out. And so, what I tell all my clients to do, I give them access to me via Vox or Marco Polo, text, however they want to do it. And I say, listen, you got something you really want to say. Don't spell it out in a long, drawn out message, text message the size of a novel. Dictate it to me. And just the other day, as a matter of fact, I was working on a project for a client, and I said, do you use Marco Polo? He said, yeah. I said, okay, so don't bother doing a whole bunch of written edits on this. Point out the paragraph in the document and tell me what it is you really want to say. And then I'll make it happen for you. So he did. And it just made it tremendously easy. He has like no time just to spare with everything that he's doing. But he had, 5 minutes to lay out about 3 or 4 things using Marco Polo. And so that's what I mean. I'm saying you can't, don't be hounding your editor, but communicate with them. Say, is there anything that how are you feeling about this chapter? Is there anything that you're having trouble, parsing through and understanding? Anything that I could reinforce or communicate in a different way that might help you? At least give them that option. They might not take it, but I think a lot of times it just leads to expansion and improving of the finished copy if you talk through it and wrestle with some of the meatier, weightier subjects.
Absolutely. Even today, there was a project I was working on for a client of mine. They had to figure out some method of reaching out to people on LinkedIn, and so I wrote a quick intro for the note section. If you click to connect to somebody, what do you add for that note? Here's the quick intro that you could use. Now that on LinkedIn is an interesting feature because it limits the number of characters you can use.
Yes.
The benefit of that is that the lengthier version, which I wrote, captures. So the process went like this: tell me what you want to say. Here's what I think. Here's what I think you do, and here's how I think you do it, and here's what I think it's amazing about your company. Here's the lengthier version. Does this match what you want to say? Yeah, great.
Mhm.
Now we're going to try and fit it into 300 words so that it's more impactful, and all of the extraneous content is ripped out.
Mhm.
That is really the benefit of having somebody who is experienced in communication, because it is our tendency to say too much and not distill out the real value out of it. Working with a good developmental editor, a good copy editor, uh, will help you refine that message. So in that debugging process, one of the things we talked about is respecting editors' boundaries.
Mhm.
Too often, I think, uh, as we develop some of these relationships, and this is maybe why you want an editor, a line or copy editor that's a little bit disconnected from you socially. Uh, Too often we give them an unfinished product,
Mhm.
and then they beat it up, and then we rewrite it and send it back to them, which is a terrible use of our time, terrible use of their time, And so we want to develop some sort of boundary in there. So I think the recommendation is write your manuscript with your developmental editor, get it
Yeah.
to where you want this thing to be, then move it on to the next stage of editing so as to reduce rework, reduce frustration, and increase efficiency.
Yeah. Don't make the perfect the enemy of the good, obviously is a good saying that's applicable here. And what I tell people is just like we said earlier on, at some point, it's good enough. You can always do a second version, a third version, a revised version, a sequel. You can do any number of things. This is not the only book you're ever going to publish. That's entirely up to you. You could publish another 1,000 books in your lifetime, potentially, depending on how many years you have left. What you shouldn't do, though, is go into the actual line and copy editing phase, and then now you're trying to add stuff or take stuff out. Unless you're doing it collaboratively with that editor, because that editor's got a sharp enough eye and the experience, and they're familiar with the content too, and they can say, you know what, this just doesn't belong here.
Yeah.
Or they can say, you're going to need to add some more meat on the bones. Um, but what you shouldn't be doing is adding new content that you forgot to write during the developmental phase. So this goes back to that whole planning. You've got that strategy and that outline already built. You do that early on and you make a decision at some point. Okay, no more new creative stuff. We're writing all of this and then we're fine tuning it. And then you make a decision. No more adding, no more subtracting. Send to the editor. The only adding or subtracting we're going to do from this point onwards is in collaboration with that copy editor if they see something. But I'm not writing more to add to
Yeah.
it. You want to write more beyond the book, then start writing content to support it, or engage a team, whatever. But don't cross that boundary. And I have some experience with this. Um, when you're approaching that editor, you need to say, I need to know what your expectations are. Because I don't want to ask you to do something that's outside the scope where we're either extending the contract, paying more money. I want to know what your limitations are. I would invite an editor to tell you that up front so that there's no ambiguity or miscommunication.
Software and product developers have this figured out because they all know that if you don't freeze your code at some point in time, you will continue to add to it, which becomes a mess to release. So, just like somebody writing a book, software product developers will develop in a before they implement in public, they will develop in private and put it on a staging server and test it. Once it's ready to go, they do a code freeze and then they release it. It's important that things do not change. Nothing structural changes after that code freeze. Likewise, in writing a book, nothing structural changes on that book by the time you get it to line editing, because you were inviting a whole host of troubles in terms of time and money and unnecessary frustration. So respect those editors' boundaries and also respect their suggestions or recommendations. It's never more frustrating than when you're a smart individual who's an expert in the field and someone asks for your input and then the person says, nah, I'm not going to take that. If that happens too many
Yeah.
times, the answer will eventually be, you know what? I don't want to talk to you anymore because you never take my advice. And
Yeah.
look, it's not turning out so well for you. So it's a fine line, what you talked about before, which is, hey, I've got my message and I'm going to stick to it. Thanks for your input. Versus, I know what I'm doing. Leave me alone. And
Yeah.
that's the stick to itedness can help you get something done, but it can also make you a real pain to work with. We want to move on to publishing. Publishing is a Publishing is an interesting process if you get into it. And we live in now a fantastically new world where anybody can publish a book. Uh, there's self-publishing, and that is as opposed to traditional publishing where people used to, a lot of books were potentially available, and then they go to a traditional publisher who just swats them down. No, 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 and a handful of
Yeah.
books come out the other end. Now we're like anybody can publish a book and say any old thing they want, and then there's a thing in the middle which splits the difference, and that's a hybrid publisher. So we've got traditional, hybrid, self-publishing, and then real quickly we're going to get into some publishing guidelines that if you are self-publishing, you're absolutely going to want to know, or you're going to mess something up and you're going to be disappointed. And what we don't want to do, we don't want to have people who've gone through this webinar be disappointed simply because you didn't take our advice. So,
Isn't
isn't
it's
that the
it's so
truth?
fun when you get to say, if you don't do this, you're gonna get sick, you're gonna die, and you're gonna deserve it because you didn't listen to me.
Anybody who's had kids can respect that. So traditional publishers, they have their own business interests in this, and they've done some of them have done it for an awfully long time. And so they do kind of know what's going to sell and what's not going to sell, and they're just not going to take a flyer on something that's not going to sell. But one of the real important things, and you talked about this before, one of the real important things to understand about a traditional publisher is many times those contracts are going to allow them to massively change your book before it gets to the shelf, which may help it, sell, but they have templates they work with. They have things they know that work, which is a benefit maybe to the author, but it also could be a detriment to your message. It depends on what you want to do. So don't be totally dismayed. There are options out of that. Something like a hybrid publisher. You've been down these roads before. Talk to us a little bit about traditional and hybrid publishing, and then we'll get to self-publishing.
Yeah, so the simplest way to understand this, Jason, is when you're dealing with a traditional publisher, one of the plus side is distribution, established business model, lots of history, easy access, right, to the what remains of the physical bookstore industry. Used to be a lot bigger. Now it's pretty much confined to small indie stores, and then the two big chains, which are Barnes and Noble and I can't think of the other one. It'll come to me. Anyway, so there, right? If you're dealing with a McGraw Hill, a Random House, a Zondervan, established traditional publishing houses who acquire their manuscripts primarily through literary agents, then your pathway is pretty clear, it's pretty defined, and it'll rise and fall on the strength of your relationships. But there are a couple of risks you run. Now, I don't mean to sound like, you know, this is not a doomsday type of thing where they wipe out three-quarters of what you've written, but they have been known in some occasions to do that. And so what you need to be aware of is that it depends on how much control, creative control, you want over the authenticity and content of that message. Now, I'm sure that this varies one publisher to another, one department to another, one genre to another. They're obviously not going to do that all the time, but they are going to engage templates. They are going to say, we know what makes people read through this book. We've researched it. We've spent hundreds of years researching it, making thousands upon thousands of mistakes, and that's their prerogative. So the distribution is excellent. But distribution is always predicated on what is actually selling at the time. And so even if you've got to deal with a traditional publisher who has great distribution, if your genre is not selling particularly well, there's still no guarantee you're actually going to get placed in that bookstore. And so whether you go with a traditional or a hybrid, or whether you can even finagle a distribution deal of your own, depends greatly on the marketplace trends of what they're hungry for. To determine actually how frequently your book shows up on a bookshelf. So that's just an important little rule of thumb. And of course, I'm not, don't take this as hard and fast. There's always exceptions. There's always ways through where there doesn't appear to be one. I know that, but just some things to have in the back of your mind. So a hybrid takes all of the distribution advantages, but then they flip the switch on the intellectual property. So they say, usually, you maintain 100% control over your intellectual property. That manuscript is yours. All we ask is that it's properly, professionally edited, and that you're coachable as we work through the process of publishing and designing and formatting it. So they're going to ask you for collaboration. They will probably, I don't know this is true for all hybrid publishers or even for all traditional publishers, but usually hybrids and traditionals are going to ask for some kind of commitment from you financially for the lifespan of that book. You're going to need to buy a certain amount of copies. Now you can do with those copies whatever you want. You can resell them at a profit. You can just pass them out. Doesn't matter, but you're going to have to probably do something like that, because they got to make their money somehow. Now they do make money off of book sales. They do make royalties, et cetera, but there's probably going to be an investment of some point, of some size there. And there's probably going to be an advance. Most of the traditional houses pay advances, many of the hybrids do. And in order to be taken seriously by industry trade publications, you got to pay in advance. It doesn't have to be more than $100, but you got to pay it. Is the prevailing consensus there? So
So
that's the traditional and hybrids. What? Yeah. What's the question?
so a lot of people nowadays are opting for something like self-publishing because it's so easy. It's a new technology that's available. It's been available for some time, but it's becoming more mainstream now. That if you want to publish your own book, you can go through a series of steps or work with somebody who can help you self-publish. It's something that we do for people. You can. The process works like this: when a person places an order online, the book is printed and shipped without your involvement. It's digitally printed. There are specifications that the person has to keep in mind. I want to get to those in our handful of minutes here. Um, when a person opts for self-publishing, there are guidelines or details that absolutely need to be followed, or your book is not going to print right, and you will increase your own frustration. Which don't do that unnecessarily. So things like interior formatting, the book has to be laid out properly. You cannot necessarily choose any old way to lay it out. There are certain sizes that the book needs to be printed in or should be printed in. There are font sizes. There are margin requirements. There are things like bleeds and trims that you need to pay attention to. And then there's a thing with the cover. People get involved in cover design because it's easy to make covers. You can make a cover on Canva and all sorts of places. But I've got this mark on here, like a big did you know? Because when you get into things like cover design, uh, there are steps in the process which you need to understand, because if you have a cover, a digital cover that's ready to be printed, it depends on the size of the spine, how big that file needs to be. And too many times you'll just like, hey, I really love that cover, but it's not going to print right because the you didn't know the size of the spine, or maybe some, you know, some trims that you needed to respect. Also, things like ISBNs, which is that number, that barcode that's printed on the back of a book, right?
Yeah.
There's an ISBN, there's an ASIN. ASINs are created by Amazon, and they're not used. They're not used across other platforms. ISBNs are. How do you get an ISBN? And do you need one? Or uh, copyrights? Do you want to send your book to the Library of Congress? Is it even necessary? All of those types of details need to be buttoned up to be able to make sure that that process is as smooth as possible. And then you've got options for distribution: Amazon, Barnes and Noble. You've got the Kindle, which is an ebook version. You've got Google, which is an ebook version. And then there are other places which act as third parties to these other services. They will make your book available on Amazon, or make your book available on Barnes and Noble or Kindle or Google Store. But they're actually a third party to the process. And then you've got ebooks and audio, which we do want to get into in our couple minutes. But I do want to say that for folks who are looking to self-publish, just like we've got that editor submission checklist, folks who are looking to self-publish, we offer a service that can help you self-publish and do some of that legwork for you and make sure everything's ready to go. And then, but you will own the accounts on Amazon and Google and all that type of stuff. So you don't have a third party involved in that. It's a consultative service with some serious legwork behind the scenes to make sure that that works for you. But let's, in our couple minutes left here, let's touch on ebooks and and then also audiobooks. So we've got two different versions. You've got the print versions, you've got the ebooks, and now audiobooks. What do you want to say about that, Paul?
Well, I think the ebook is a tremendous, if you're, especially if you're doing any kind of business or fundraising or anything where you're trying to move people towards partnering with you, investing with you, doing business with you. Tremendously useful. One of the reasons is you don't have to print copies of it. So there's really, once you've got it done and it's up there, there's really no overhead. You can send it a million times as a digital file, and you can charge just a small 2.99 or something for it. And it's if you get your marketing right, it can be a great profit center for you, or at least not a profit center, but a center of income that can help cover your costs of marketing and exposing the book to a broader audience. We had a great conversation, Jason, and I know we're getting down on time here, about audiobooks. And I think, first of all, I want to say with both ebooks and audiobooks, there is a modern day market expectation, particularly in the business world, that you can reach people more than one in more than one format than just print. And so I would say at a minimum do a print and an ebook version, because ebook is wonderful. You get make it once and sell it as many times as you want to. But an audiobook requires a bit more of an investment of your time, particularly if you decide to be the person to read it. And one of the things that you really have to consider as well is, should you be the person to read it? Now, I know you wrote it, but that doesn't mean you should be the person to read it. I've had a lot of people tell me, your voice is majestic, you should be reading your book. Yes, but there's a difference between having a great voice and being a good actor who can read a book in a way that is engaging and um, transmits or transfers that energy from the speaker to the listener. That's a different skill set. You want to pay attention to that.
Just like a person who acts on stage, I always talk about you need to act to the last row in that theater. The first row is going to pick you up fine. The last row, they need to hear you, they need to feel you. And what that creates is a bigger than life energy that will feel unnatural if you've never done it before. And so nuance, inflection, how you present that information is super, super important, and it will dramatically affect how that message is received. Now, in our final minutes here, I do want to offer people, if you have a collection of things you want us to take a look at and say, where do I go from here? We do offer consultation. Number one, join our free global community. You get community support, content, and training, and then we can help you manage, create, sell your experience and expertise, just like we're doing here. And then I do want to offer you this. We got a book strategy series. You're going to get expert guidance, a written strategy. You're going to get clear next steps with 3 90-minute strategy calls in which you'll have your outline, your journey map, your core pillars. And if you don't know what we're talking about, it's because you missed a webinar 1 and 2, planning and writing. DM us. We'll send you the links for those. And then if you're ready to rock and roll on getting your idea to paper and published, that's our idea to done 18-week coaching. Not only you're going to get the expert guidance and a written strategy, but your book could be written and published in those 18 weeks. Obviously, you need to do the work. You're the person who's got to get that done, but you're going to have some people to walk alongside with you. There are weekly 60-minute calls, on-demand video calls, and a lot more. If you're interested in that, let us know. I'm going to go ahead and leave this on the screen here in just a little bit, but close us out. We've got about 30 seconds left, Paul. Anything you'd like to leave people with?
There's a lot of detail to this, and it can seem overwhelming at times. The reality is, it's just new to you, but it's not new to us, right? It's not new to anybody who's worth their salt in our industry, which is why I say that um, it's much easier to walk through this. I've heard Jason say this before. It's much easier to walk through this process when there's somebody alongside you who knows what they're doing. These are not this is not rocket science, but it does require attention to detail, and it does require knowing what details to pay attention to. So if you're looking for help with that in any way we can, whether just through the being part of the free community, whether you would like to just set up a strategy, or whether you want to go all the way and get it done, we would love to partner with you in that.
All righty. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. I want to respect your time. DM us if you'd like replays on that other content, or if you want to get involved with coaching, need somebody to review your stuff. We'll see you next time. I'll leave this up on the screen. Thanks for coming.